When a black cleaning lady's son claimed he spoke 9 languages, a billionaire laughed in his face. Seconds later, that laugh froze, and what followed would shatter everything he thought he knew about power. The Manhattan skyline glowed behind glass walls, a billion-dollar view reserved for the few who could afford it. Inside the penthouse office, silence pressed against the air until it shattered with a boy's voice, steady yet impossibly out of place. I speak 9 languages. Hassan al-Mansuri, oil tycoon, billionaire man who owned half the buildings within sight, leaned back in his $15,000 leather chair. For a moment he simply stared, and then the laugh came, deep and rolling, echoing through the marble and glass like the roar of a predator amused by its prey. His gold cufflinks glinted as he pointed toward the boy. Kid, you barely speak English. What are you? A diplomat now? His laughter filled every corner, bouncing off the Persian rug under the boy's shoes, turning the words into weapons. David Johnson, 14 years old, clutched the straps of a worn public school backpack. The room seemed designed to crush him, the towering shelves of imported books, the polished mahogany desk, the vast window that dwarfed his small frame. Every detail screamed that he did not belong here. Beside him, his mother Grace stood half-hidden, her shoulders bent as if to make herself smaller, a plastic cleaning bucket trembling in her hands. She had seen this moment coming the second her son had opened his mouth. David, she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of years scrubbing these floors, please apologize to Mr. Al-Mansuri. Hassan smirked, eyes glinting with cruel amusement. He lived for these tiny humiliations, moments when wealth could crush hope with nothing but laughter. Grace's words hung in the air like chains. She wanted to pull her son back into silence, into safety, before he said something else that would cost her the job she had fought to keep for 5 long years. David didn't move. His jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't waver. He let the silence stretch, let Hassan's laughter echo into nothing, let the sting of humiliation burn across his cheeks until it cooled into resolve. He took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate, as if each word carried its own weight. English, Spanish, French, German, Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, Italian, Portuguese. 9 words. Each precise, each delivered with clarity that did not belong to a nervous boy, but to someone who had trained his tongue to obey discipline stronger than fear. Hassan's grin froze halfway across his face. The rhythm of his laugh faltered. For the first time in years, silence struck him speechless. His mocking expression lingered, but his eyes betrayed the flicker of uncertainty, the smallest fracture in a fortress of arrogance. Grace stared at her son, her breath caught. She didn't understand what he had just done, only that the sound of those names, rolling flawlessly off his tongue, had changed the air in the room. The bucket in her hands felt heavier, but her heart, for the first time that day, lifted. Hassan blinked, shifting in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. He had expected a child's stammer, a pathetic attempt easily crushed. Instead, he had been met with confidence, a litany that carried more power than wealth. His mouth opened, searching for the next laugh, but the sound would not come. In that pause, in that crack of silence, something irreversible had begun. The game he thought he was playing no longer belonged entirely to him. Hassan leaned back in his chair, the city's glittering skyline painting cold light across his sharp features. The smirk returned, though it was thinner now, stretched like a mask over something unsettled. He steepled his fingers and let the silence draw out, savoring the illusion that he still held complete control. Then his voice cut through the room, deep and commanding. Then impress me, boy, speak Arabic. It was not a request. It was a trap, designed to expose a child's bluff and bury him in ridicule. Grace's heart nearly stopped. Her knuckles whitened around the handle of her bucket. She had cleaned this office long enough to know Hassan's cruel games. No one survived them unscathed. She wanted to scream for David to stop, to stay quiet, to bow his head the way she always had. But David's face did not break. He stood still, his backpack against his chest, his eyes steady. When he opened his mouth, the words did not stumble, they flowed. Classical Arabic, not the simple phrases a tourist memorized, but complex, precise, alive with rhythm and form. The words carried weight, a cadence older than the skyscrapers surrounding them, as if the boy had borrowed his voice from history itself. Hassan's smile faltered, just a flicker, but enough to reveal that the blow had landed. For the first time in years, he was forced to process a sound he could not instantly dismiss. Still, he was not ready to yield. Fine, he said, switching languages mid-sentence, rapid-fire questions in Arabic that twisted grammar, tested nuance, probed for weakness. Each question was a blade, sharpened with the arrogance of a man certain no child could parry. But David parried everyone. His answers came measured and calm, not rushed, not desperate, but precise, every verb aligned, every tense unshaken. His tone was respectful yet unyielding, as if he had decided long ago that dignity did not require permission. Grace felt her chest tighten, tears pressing at the edges of her eyes. This was her son, the boy she had raised in the Bronx with nothing but late-night library visits and whispered encouragement, now standing unshaken in the office of a man who thought power was absolute. Hassan shifted in his chair, his amusement eroding into something more dangerous. He reached for the weapon that had always served him best, dismissal. He leaned forward, scoffing, trying to reassert dominance. Enough. That means nothing. Anyone can memorize a few phrases. But even as he spoke, his voice lacked its usual steel. His hands betrayed him, fingers drumming against the armrest too fast, too sharp. David did not argue. He did not plead. He simply reached into his worn backpack and with deliberate calm withdrew a folder. He placed it gently on the edge of Hassan's marble desk. Hassan hesitated, then pulled the papers free. His eyes scanned the stamps, the seals, the embossed insignia of Columbia University. Certificates of proficiency, evaluations signed by professors, documents that spoke not of a child's fantasy but of years of discipline and undeniable achievement. Hassan's jaw tightened. His mind searched for exits, for explanations, for some rope to pull the illusion of control back into his hands. Fake, he muttered, too quickly. He tossed the papers onto the desk as though they burned his fingers. All fake, printed at some shop downtown. But the word did not land with the power he expected. It wavered in the air like smoke, unconvincing even to his own ears. David stood silent, his eyes steady, his body language a quiet refusal to shrink. He did not shout, did not protest. He simply let the truth sit there, undeniable, like a stone too heavy for Hassan to lift. For the first time, the billionaire who had humiliated countless men and women in this very office found himself staring into eyes that did not break, and realized the game he thought he controlled was slipping from his grasp. The office was still, the weight of the moment pressing against every polished surface. Hassan had tossed the certificates aside as if they were scraps of paper, his voice snapping with a brittle edge. Fake, all fake. He wanted his words to sound final, absolute, but the echo in the room betrayed him. The confidence was gone, replaced by something thinner, something that trembled if you listened closely enough. David did not flinch. His hands rested calmly on the straps of his worn backpack. His voice measured, steady, and deliberate. That's why I brought this. Slowly, he pulled out a battered tablet, its case scratched from years of use. With a few taps, the screen glowed to life, and before Hassan could interrupt, a face appeared, an older woman with glasses perched on her nose, papers stacked high around her desk. Behind her were bookshelves lined with volumes in Chinese characters. Professor Chen, David greeted in flawless Mandarin, the tones precise. The rhythm natural, not rehearsed but lived. Hassan's smirk faltered instantly. The sound of the language was undeniable, the flow too natural, too effortless to be memorized. Professor Chen's expression warmed, her voice animated as she responded in rapid Mandarin, the kind of exchange only true fluency could sustain. David answered with ease, shifting between formal phrasing and casual nuance, his tone carrying the subtlety of someone who understood not just the words, but the culture embedded within them. Hassan sat frozen, the dialogue washing over him like a storm he could not control. He didn't understand a word, but he could hear it, the cadence, the fluidity, the undeniable mark of mastery. After a few moments, Professor Chen switched to English, her tone firm, certain. Mr. Al-Mansuri, I have taught linguistics for 15 years at Columbia. David Johnson is the most extraordinary student I have ever had. At 14, his Mandarin is indistinguishable from a native speaker of Beijing. He is, without exaggeration, a prodigy. The words landed like blows. Hassan's fingers tightened against the armrest of his chair. His laugh, his favorite weapon, refused to surface. The power dynamic in the room shifted by the second, invisible but undeniable, tilting toward the boy who refused to bend. Grace covered her mouth with trembling hands, her eyes darting between her son and the glowing screen, barely able to process what she was witnessing. Her boy, the child she had walked to the Bronx Library every afternoon, was being declared the best student a world-class professor had ever taught. The professor continued, describing David's aptitude for simultaneous translation, his ability to move between registers, his instinctive grasp of idiomatic nuance. Hassan cut the call abruptly, his hand shaking slightly as he slammed the tablet onto the desk. The silence that followed was heavier than before. "This means nothing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Anyone can impress a soft-hearted academic." David met his gaze, calm and unyielding. "I didn't have tutors, sir. I didn't have private schools or family money. I had a library card. That's where I learned Mandarin. That's where I learned Spanish. That's where I learned them all." The words dropped like stones, each one dragging Hassan deeper into disbelief. A library card. Public spaces he had never set foot in. Places he dismissed as breeding grounds for mediocrity. And yet, in front of him stood proof that brilliance did not need privilege, only determination. Grace's eyes filled with tears, her pride swelling through the fear that had once shackled her voice. She had scrubbed offices, bent her back to exhaustion, to buy her son second-hand books and give him a chance. And here he stood, her sacrifice made flesh, wielding knowledge like a sword against a man who thought money made him untouchable. Hassan shifted again, restless in his chair. His empire was built on control, on the certainty that power silenced all challengers. But here was a child who could not be silenced, whose words pierced deeper than wealth could shield. The billionaire's hands twitched, searching for something to cling to. He reached for his glass of water, but even the crystal trembled against the marble desk. David's voice broke the silence once more, quiet but immovable. "You asked me to impress you. I didn't bring these languages to impress. I brought them to remind you that value isn't defined by your wealth, or my mother's job, or the clothes I wear. Value is in what you can do, in what you can create, even when the world tells you that you have nothing." For the first time in years, Hassan had no reply. The arrogance that had once filled the room like smoke was thinning, dissipating into a truth he could not laugh away. And in that silence, the balance of power shifted again, tilting irrevocably toward the boy who refused to bow. Hassan's hand lingered on the crystal glass, his knuckles white as he set it back on the desk with more force than he intended. The silence between them stretched until it threatened to crack. He cleared his throat, reaching for the authority that had once come so easily. "Enough," he said, the word sharp though thinner than before. "Parlor tricks, clever phrases, professors eager to flatter a poor boy for attention. But business, boy, business is not about pretty words. It is about results." His voice rose as if volume could replace conviction. David didn't blink. He slipped another document from his backpack, placing it on the polished marble with the same calm he had shown all along. "Then let's talk about results." Hassan frowned, irritated, but curiosity tugged his hand forward. He pulled the stapled pages toward him, his eyes scanning the first lines. Within seconds, the color drained from his face. The report was meticulous. Rows of notes in neat handwriting, each section analyzing public statements, investor calls, and international contracts issued by his own company. Red marks highlighted errors in terminology, mistranslations that warped intent, cultural nuances ignored. Hassan's breath grew shallow as his eyes landed on the heading, "Lost revenue projections due to linguistic miscommunication." $50 million, David said quietly. "That's how much your last Middle Eastern contract nearly cost you. You confused Mubashir with Mubadir. You said Muraik instead of Muraib. Your investors thought you promised flexibility. In reality, you promised failure." Hassan's head snapped up, sweat beading at his temple. He remembered the call, remembered the confusion on the faces of his partners, the awkward silence he had blamed on poor internet connection. His lips parted, but no words came. Grace stared at her son in disbelief, struggling to understand the scale of what he had just revealed. This wasn't schoolwork. This wasn't a child's hobby. This was the dismantling of an empire's illusion of competence. Hassan slammed the papers down, his voice breaking. "You're setting me up. You planted this, forged these notes, twisted them to make me look incompetent." His tone cracked between rage and fear, but the words carried no power. They fell flat in the heavy air. The same air now thick with the undeniable scent of truth. David stood tall, unflinching. "No, sir, these are your words, public, recorded. Anyone with time and patience could see the pattern. I only followed the evidence." The boy's calmness made the accusation of forgery sound desperate. Hassan's chest rose and fell too quickly. He had humiliated presidents of corporations, silenced lawyers, broken unions with nothing but his sneer. Yet here he was, being dismantled piece by a boy with a backpack and a library card. He gripped the edge of the desk, his voice lowering to a growl. "Think you've won something here? You think you can stand in my office?" And he stopped when David reached into the backpack once more, slower this time, deliberate. He pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it in the center of the desk. A simple device, cheap, unassuming. But Hassan's stomach tightened the moment he saw it. David pressed play. The machine clicked, and then the office filled with Hassan's unmistakable voice, smooth and cruel. These black Americans are all the same. Lazy, uneducated, always blaming others for their failures. That's why I only hire Arabs and whites for important positions. The words cut through the room like shards of glass. Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Hassan's body went rigid, blood draining from his face. He remembered the moment instantly, the elevator ride with his vice president, the casual venom he had spoken, believing no one else could hear. Now those words came back to him, amplified, undeniable, in the presence of the very woman he had dismissed for years and the son he had tried to humiliate. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the hum of the city outside seemed to vanish, leaving only the echo of Hassan's prejudice hanging in the air. He lurched forward, snatching at the recorder as if grabbing it could erase what had already been spoken. "Where did you get this? Where?" His voice was hoarse. Breaking into panic, David did not move, his eyes locked on Hassan's. "In the elevator last week, you didn't notice me. New York is a one-party consent state. The recording is legal." Hassan's breath came fast, ragged. He knew the truth of it. He knew what a recording like this meant: lawsuits, investigations, reputations shattered beyond repair. The billions he had built teetered on the edge of collapse, and it was a 14-year-old boy holding the lever. Grace stood frozen, her tears falling silently. The humiliation she had swallowed for years, the insults she had endured, were now exposed in the billionaire's own voice. Hassan's hand trembled above the recorder, but he didn't press stop. He couldn't. The walls that had protected him all his life had crumbled with the press of a button. In that instant, the predator became prey, and the boy he had marked became the one who held his future in the palm of his hand. Hassan's skin had turned ashen, his hands trembling as if the air itself had turned cold around him. The recording still echoed in his mind, each word he had once spoken so carelessly now transformed into a weapon sharper than any blade. He had built an empire on dominance, but now every stone of it felt like it was crumbling under the steady gaze of a 14-year-old boy. David sat calmly in the chair opposite him, the backpack that had produced every devastating piece of evidence resting by his feet like an arsenal. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet was heavier than Hassan's fury. The boy glanced at his watch, his tone precise, surgical. "You have 4 minutes left. Decide." Hassan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The command came not as a plea, not as a threat barked in anger, but as a fact delivered by someone who already knew the outcome. He wanted to protest, to roar, to reassert himself, but the power had shifted completely. David leaned forward slightly, his eyes steady. "I want 3 things. First, you will promote my mother to facility supervisor with a salary of $80,000 a year. She has given this company 5 years of service without respect. That ends now. Second, you will create a scholarship program for young people from disadvantaged communities. Talent is wasted when opportunity is denied. Third, you will hire me as a junior language consultant. You've seen the mistakes. You know what I can do. You know I can save you millions." Hassan shook his head in disbelief, the words colliding in his mind. You're 14. This is absurd. No board, no shareholder would ever allow." David's voice cut across his protest like steel through cloth. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The billionaire's pulse quickened. He turned to Grace, desperate, but she said nothing. Her eyes, once full of fear, now shone with a pride that left him even more unsteady. For the first time she stood taller, shoulders squared, no longer invisible. Hassan's lips moved, searching for a counter, an excuse, any lifeline to grab hold of. "Even if I agreed, how do I know you won't destroy me anyway? How do I know you won't release the recording the second I sign?" David reached down, opened his backpack again, and placed a second folder on the desk. A contract, neatly bound, detailed with clauses and protections. Hassan opened it with shaking hands. Every page was professional, airtight, covering not only the terms David had demanded, but also legal safeguards that guaranteed no retaliation, no loopholes, no way to wriggle free without exposing himself further. The boy had anticipated everything. Hassan's throat tightened as he read, his vision blurring. The humiliation was complete. He had once prided himself on being the predator who thought 3 steps ahead of every rival. But here was a boy who had thought 5. David sat motionless, watching him drown in silence. "This isn't negotiation," Hassan whispered finally, his voice hollow. "This is blackmail." David shook his head, calm and unwavering. "No, this is balance. You've spent years using your power to crush people like my mother. I'm offering you a chance to use it for something better." The choice is yours. Hassan's hand hovered over the contract, his golden pen heavy in his grip. The city outside sparkled with the life he had always believed he controlled, yet now he felt smaller than he had ever been. The clock on the wall ticked, each second louder than the last. He imagined the headlines, the lawsuits, the collapse of everything he had built. And then he looked at the boy across from him, steady, unbroken, holding nothing but truth and preparation, and knew the balance of power had been rewritten. 2 minutes, David said softly. Hassan's hand shook as he lowered the pen toward the page. Standing at the edge of surrender and survival, the weight of his empire balanced on the stroke of ink he was about to write. 6 months later, the Bronx Public Library no longer felt like the quiet refuge of a boy sneaking hours of study after school. It had transformed into something else, a beating heart of opportunity. The smell of old books still lingered. The long wooden tables still carried the scratches of years of restless readers, but now they were filled with children leaning over laptops, young men and women studying textbooks in languages they had never dreamed of learning, and volunteers guiding them through lessons. At the center of it all sat Hassan al-Mansuri, the man once feared for his cruelty, now listening as a 15-year-old explained a passage of text to a circle of students half his age. Grace Johnson stood nearby, no longer in the faded uniform of a cleaning lady, but in a tailored navy suit, her ID badge marked facility supervisor, a symbol not just of promotion, but of dignity restored. Hassan adjusted his cufflinks, though this time not as a display of arrogance, but as a nervous habit. He looked at the children around him and then at David, seated at a desk strewn with contracts written in multiple languages. 6 months ago I was blind, Hassan said, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. I thought money gave me vision, but it made me forget where I came from, forget that I was once like you. The students leaned in. Their curiosity piqued. Hassan swallowed, his eyes drifting toward David. I came to this country at 16, I barely spoke English. I carried bags in the rain outside an airport to survive, and yet I let myself believe I was superior once I had wealth. David reminded me of the truth. He replanted my roots. Grace's eyes softened. For years she had endured his arrogance, and now she watched him confess his own buried history in the very building where her son had built himself. David lifted his gaze from the contracts, his expression calm, but carrying the weight of someone far older than 15. Roots don't disappear, he said. You just stopped watering yours. Hassan let the words settle, his breath uneven. It was true. He had not only forgotten his struggle, he had erased it. Built walls to separate himself from the very people he once resembled. And here, in the same library he had never set foot in, the boy he tried to humiliate had held up a mirror to his past. Around them, the program was thriving. Dozens of students filled the room, each holding books or tablets purchased through the scholarship fund David had demanded. Hassan had once seen public libraries as irrelevant, places for those without ambition. Now he saw them as treasure chests, each child unlocking possibilities that money alone could never buy. Grace moved through the aisles, greeting parents, encouraging students, her presence no longer silent but authoritative. Staff treated her with respect, a leader whose decisions shaped futures rather than a worker ignored in the background. She was the same woman Hassan had dismissed for years, but now she stood in her rightful place, elevated not by pity but by justice. David, meanwhile, had become a figure whispered about across boardrooms. At 15, he was already the youngest language consultant in corporate history, his corrections and translations generating hundreds of millions of dollars in recovered business. Companies that once saw him as a child now listened when he spoke, because he spoke with the clarity of preparation and the evidence of results. Hassan glanced at him again, remembering the arrogance with which he had laughed that first day. He had believed power meant silencing others. Now he understood real power came from listening, from lifting. The irony was bitter but liberating. David had not just saved his company, he had saved his memory of who he once was. A group of students gathered closer, one girl asking, "Mr. Al-Mansuri, is it true David got his first job by blackmailing you?" The room tensed, waiting. Hassan chuckled softly for the first time without cruelty. "It's true, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me." Laughter rippled through the group, but beneath it was awe. The mighty had confessed, and the lesson was clear. David had become more than a boy who spoke 9 languages. He had become a symbol. For the children hunched over their books, he was proof that origins were not destiny. For Hassan, he was a reflection of the immigrant boy he had once been, a reflection he had tried to bury under layers of wealth and arrogance. The library buzzed with the hum of learning, and in that noise Hassan felt something he had not felt in decades. Hope. The international conference hall glowed with cameras and bright lights, the air heavy with the hum of simultaneous translation equipment and the watchful eyes of reporters from every corner of the world. At the center table sat executives, investors, and diplomats, their pens ready, their contracts stacked high, but all eyes were not on them. They were on the 15-year-old boy who sat poised at the end of the table, headset in place, his young face lit by the glow of 1,000 flashbulbs. David Johnson moved between Mandarin, Arabic, French, and English with the ease of breathing, his voice clear, precise, and confident. He translated billion-dollar negotiations in real time, not missing a beat, bridging worlds with nothing but his command of words. When the final clause was signed, sealing a $500 million agreement, the room erupted into applause. The investors shook hands. Reporters surged forward, but the cameras swung toward David. He removed his headset slowly, calm even in the chaos, as though he had expected this moment all along. A journalist pushed through the crowd, microphone in hand. "David," she asked, "what message do you want young people watching this to take from your story?" David's gaze swept across the room, past the cameras, past the flashing lights, as though he was speaking not just to the press, but to every unseen listener beyond the glass walls. His words came steady, low, carrying the kind of weight that settles deep in the bones. "Origins don't define destiny," he said. "Where you come from, the labels people put on you, the jobs your parents do, none of it decides who you are. What decides is what you do with the time you're given, what you build with what little you have." A hush fell over the hall. Even the cameras seemed to pause. Grace, standing at the edge of the room in her tailored suit, felt her heart swell. For years she had feared her son would be crushed under the weight of a world that never expected anything from him. Now he stood in front of the world declaring that expectation itself was the enemy. A second reporter turned to Grace. "And what about you, Mrs. Johnson? How does it feel to raise someone the world is calling a prodigy?" She drew in a breath. Her voice steady, her posture tall, her eyes shining with pride. "I didn't just raise a genius," she said. "I raised a man who knows his worth and refuses to accept less than dignity." The words landed with force, a mother reclaiming every insult she had once swallowed. Hassan sat a few seats away, silent at first, the weight of memory pressing hard against his chest. Finally, he leaned toward the microphones, his voice raw, stripped of the arrogance that once defined him. "He didn't just save my company," he admitted, each syllable heavy. "He saved my soul." A ripple moved through the crowd. A billionaire confessing not to financial error, but to moral bankruptcy, and to the boy who had forced him to remember. The cameras swung back to David, waiting for his reaction. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile in triumph. Instead, he reached calmly into his backpack, the same one that had once unleashed a storm in Hassan's office, and pulled out a small device. He placed it on the table, pressing play. The room filled with voices, his, Hassan's, Grace's from that fateful day 6 months earlier. Every exchange, every demand, every confession. Gasps spread through the audience. Hassan froze, realization dawning that the entire confrontation had been documented. David let the recording play for a few moments before turning it off. "For your information," he said, his tone steady, "I keep evidence of everything, not because I don't trust, but because truth should always protect itself." A shiver ran through the hall. It was not arrogance, but preparation. It was not a threat, but a safeguard. The boy had not only outsmarted a billionaire, he had ensured the story could never be twisted, never be buried, never be stolen from those who needed to hear it. The applause came again, but this time it was different. It was not for the deal, not for the profit. It was for the truth spoken aloud, for the courage of a child who had turned humiliation into history. Grace closed her eyes, whispering a silent thank you. Hassan lowered his head, not in defeat but in humility. And David, calm as ever, stood before the cameras with nothing but his words, his evidence, and his unshakable resolve. In that moment, he was no longer just the boy who spoke 9 languages. He was the voice of a generation, reminding the world that the sharpest weapon is preparation, the strongest shield is dignity, and the greatest inheritance is hope. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.